He's a gold medalist of Delhi Higher Secondary Board and Delhi University. His book, The Black Economy in India, published in 1999, 2002, and 2017, has broken new ground in macroeconomics and on thinking about the Indian economy and development. His book, Indian Economy Since Independence Persisting Colonial Disruption, 2013, presents a holistic view of Indian economy combining history, political science, international relations, and economics, along with the black economy, environmental concerns, and technology. He has also published Understanding Black Economy and Black Money in India, an inquiry into the causes, consequences, and remedies in 2017, and another book titled Demonetization and Black Economy in 2017. His book on GST, titled Ground Scorching Tax, has come in February 2019. He was awarded the Ricardo Prize in Economics by IIES of UNAM, Mexico in 2013. He has published over 100 articles in academic journals and over 400 articles in popular press and contributed to public discussions on policy since 1980. He has been working on building a framework of alternative economic policies in India. He authored the alternative budgets for 1993-94 and 94-95. He was associated with the Alternative Economic Surveys for 18 years. He has been involved in creating public awareness on economic issues through writing in the popular press, participating on TV, and talks at various fora. He worked in the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy on a report on Black economy in India in 1982 to 85 for the Central Board of Direct Taxes, Government of India. Sir, it's an absolute privilege to have you with us today. I now kindly invite you to start the lecture. To all the participants, to all the participants, please drop in your questions in the Q&A box. Sir will take it towards the end of the lecture. Sir, all over to you.
Thank you, Resham, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. My greetings to fellow teachers and students and so on. This topic that I have agreed to speak on, impact of coronavirus and lockdown in the Indian economy, and I've added the road ahead because we are headed towards a new normal, and that is what we need to think about also, as I'll try and mention at the end. So I hope you are able to see the PPT.
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay,
sir.
Good. So as a preliminary, what I'm going to present, its theoretical basis is based on my EPW article of September 26, 2020, and the book that has come out, The Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis, the Impact of Coronavirus and the Road Ahead. So the point I'll be making is that the crisis facing Indian economy and society is the greatest that we've faced in the post-independence period, because the collapse of the economy was unprecedented. And that collapse has social and political impact, which will be long lasting. Now, if you look at the quarterly official data, then you find that the economy slumped very badly. And this is the official data. And I'll argue that actually even this does not give us the full picture of what happened. If you look at the period just before the pandemic, starting 2012-13, then you find that the economy was going downhill very rapidly even before the pandemic. That means some kind of a crisis was brewing even before the pandemic. For 8 quarters, the rate of growth dropped from about 8% to about 3.5%. So the last line shows you that. Now, some facts about the Indian economy. The GDP data that is official has a large error in it, as I have mentioned in my book. And that is because the unorganized sector, which is hit very badly by the pandemic and earlier by demonetization and GST, that is not taken into account in the GDP data, the quarterly data or the advanced estimates that come. So if the unorganized sector, which is 45% of the output and 94% of the employment, is proxied only by the organized sector, then that is not correct for a variety of reasons. For instance, the agriculture data for quarter 1, when the economy was supposed to have dropped by 23.9%, there it was argued that agriculture was the only sector that was growing at about 3.4%. But when I looked at the Press Information Bureau's release, I found that the agriculture data also was not complete. In fact, for horticulture, pisciculture, floriculture, milk, poultry, etc., it was assumed that the targets have been achieved. Whereas we know that that was not the case, because a lot of fruits and vegetables rotted in the field. In my book, I have given data showing that the arrival of fruits and vegetables in the Azadpur Mandi, which is the biggest mandi in North India, that had become half of what it was the previous year. That means half the fruits and vegetables were rotting in the fields. Similarly, the milk production declined because demand for milk went down dramatically, since the sweet shops are closed, hotels and restaurants were closed, and these are the bulk consumers of milk. Also, the midday meal scheme had stopped, so the demand for eggs also dropped very sharply, and people stopped eating chicken. So a lot of chicken was culled at that time. Flowers could not come to the market from the fields, and they were allowed to wither away. So therefore, even agriculture, my argument is, actually declined rather than rise by 3.4%, as is given there. So, if you look at the data, uh, these are the variables that are used in the annual estimate for the advanced estimate of the GDP. And you see, except for a few items like production of rice and fish, most of the items actually pertain to the organized sector. So it's the organized sector data that's available, and that is what is used, in calculating the rate of growth of the economy. And we know that the unorganized sector declined, so that data was not used, not available. And also, you can see that a lot of data is available only up to October, November, December, not for the full year. So projections have had to be done. Now, when projections are done, we know that index of industrial production, which is one of the items that is used, for that the data is available only for 7 months. And then what we do is we project that data for the balance of the 5 months by using the ratios derived in the past. But after a shock like the pandemic or the GST or the demonetization, those ratios change, and therefore the old ratio doesn't work, and that's why there's further error in the data. Now, let's look at some of these facts. The government has claimed that the recovery has taken place after April, but the problem is that major sectors still remain weak, like, for instance, hotels, restaurants, travel, tourism, the education, etc. So major sectors of the economy still remain very weak, and they have not recovered back to where they were in January 2020. The CPI data, the WPI data, we can see, GDP data last year was 204 lakh crore, and now it has come down. So my estimate is that even if it falls by 18%, it'll come down to 167 lakh crores. But if it comes down by 29%, then it comes down to 145 lakh crores. And my guess is that the economy is down by 29% for the year as a whole, given that it had dropped by 75% in the month of April. If you look at the capacity utilization data, for Q1, the capacity had gone down to 48%, in the organized sector, and the unorganized sector completely closed down. And investment in April fell by 90%, so the investment almost completely stopped. Exports and imports of goods fell by about 50% in the month of April when lockdown was there. So in other words, there was a deep, deep impact on the economy, and the economy did not drop by only 23.9% in Q1, but by a much larger amount. Now, unemployment also rose very dramatically because in the unorganized sector, people could not go to work. And even in the organized sector, people could not go to work. And that's why you saw that large number of people started migrating from the cities to the villages, in very difficult circumstances, with heat and lack of water and food. They just started walking with, children in tow and the luggage on their heads. They were in desperate conditions, because as the Azim Premji study showed, that 80% of the people said they did not have money even to buy 1 week of supplies. And that's why, they started starving if they stayed back in the city. So in the non-agriculture sector of the unorganized sector also, the work almost stopped. Now, I distinguish between employment and work. So, if you look at the CMIE data, the CMIE data says that 122 million people lost employment in April of last year, as soon as the lockdown was declared. But my argument is that the work dropped for 200 million people, because not only did people who were losing employment not working, but a lot of people who stayed on the rolls of the factories or offices, they could not go to work. So 200 million people lost work, and they also lost incomes. A lot of people who continued to have employment, like in the case of media, they also had to face salary cuts. I have some young friends, they all complained that they had the salary cuts of up to 50% and thereabouts. So my argument is that the work was lost and incomes are lost. Now, this slide is not coming because I'm using a different version of the thing, but this slide was basically to show that India was the most affected out of the G20 countries. Our rate of growth dropped very sharply, and the reason that our rate of growth dropped very sharply was because we have a very large unorganized sector. Now, in October, the Ministry of Finance reported the following high frequency data as having come close to its level in February 2020. So this is index of industrial production, core sector, electricity demand, GST, CMIE employment data, diesel and petrol demand, steel consumption, etc. But the point is, most of this pertains to the organized sector and not the unorganized sector. So again, as I was saying, the unorganized sector data was not used. IHS Market India Manufacturing Purchase Managers Index, called PMI, that has risen above 50, but it's a month-to-month index. So therefore, it only shows that on the preceding month what the growth was. But since the growth had dropped by 75% in April, even if you have 10% growth on that, you still not be able to come back to where you were originally. So the IHS market data doesn't tell us that we are back to where we were in January 2020. But there was a not so good news, and there we have both macro and micro. Employment still is down. A lot of people are complaining, and as the recent survey by Azim Premji University showed, that 20% of those who lost work in April, May, they still haven't got work back. And many salaried employees haven't got their full salary back. So therefore, demand is short. And as I said, we have to distinguish in employment and work. So even though employment may not have dropped, the people's work dropped. In fact, the central government has only now come out with a notification saying everybody has to come to work. So which implies that even a lot of government employees were not working full time, only working part time. And as I said earlier, 80% in the survey said they cannot bear the cost of COVID. And that's why they are slipping below the poverty line. Currency with the public has increased very sharply. And that's because, when there's uncertainty, people go liquid. So the currency to GDP ratio has shot up beyond what it was before demonetization. And that is showing that the uncertainty continues to prevail. The RBI's consumer confidence index is at 55.5, so it remains very weak. It's only above 100 that you can say that the confidence has resumed, but consumer confidence index at 55.5 in January 2021 implies that consumers are still very uncertain about buying, and that will mean that the demand will be weak. And that is the reason why people are liquid. That's why currency with public has increased sharply. Similarly, business sentiment remains very weak. Business sentiment has not revived because there's uncertainty. There's a possibility of a second wave with, the new virus mutants coming in, like the South African and the UK mutants, cases rising in Kerala and in Bombay. Compared to where they were, revenue collection is down by 33%, and fiscal deficit in the budget has gone up to 9.5%. Now, if you look at the not so good news, which is sectoral, one thing that I keep looking at is the newspaper size, and most newspapers are way below the size that they used to have, And that's because advertising has come down. And the number of pages which had increased around Diwali again came down. A lot of brick and mortar retail stores, they have been complaining that, in spite of the festive season, the sales did not increase at the same rate. And that is largely because people have switched from brick and mortar stores to e-commerce. Hotels, restaurants, travel, tourism, they continue to face challenges because here you require contact. So close contact is still, infectious, and that's why people are still not going out as much to hotels, restaurants, not doing so much travel and tourism. Railways, which used to run 14,000 passenger trains a day, are still running about 1,000 trains. And similar stories are there. Like for instance, in the metro, where in one coach you could have 100, 150 people. Now they're barely about 50 people. In the buses, where you could carry 50, 60 people, you have about 15, 20 people traveling. So everywhere there's a issue that's there. And then, of course, All India Manufacturers Organizations says that large number of small businesses are closing down. And Confederation of All India Traders Association also says that many small shops are closing down. So the data again came about a month back that among the small businesses, 1 in 5 are not able to pay EMI because their business has not come back to where it was. Education and health are still down. School and colleges reopening has had difficulties. Classes to hold physical classes has been proving to be difficult. Real estate sales are also still not back to where they were, but of course the real estate sales have been down for the last 8 years because of excess stock of real estate that has been there. Religious places also reopened with great deal of delay, and there also people have not been going as much as they were going earlier. Book sales are also down, as book shops suggest. So a lot of sectoral decline is there, and that's why I argue that even in January 2021, we are at least 10% down compared to earlier. Whereas the government says that we have now recovered back to where January 2020 is. And that's the reason why, if starting at April when it was down 75%, and now it's still down by about 10%, if you take the average, you'll come to a decline in the growth rate of the economy by about 30%. Now, why did we have the lockdown? Lockdown is not a solution to a disease. Lockdown only prevents people from meeting so that the disease doesn't spread rapidly. This disease is a very infectious disease. If you look at the last 20 years, this is the seventh virus that has come in the last 20 years. Seventh new virus. There are 5,000 viruses that affect human beings, but 7 have come in the last 20 years. So we've had SARS and MERS and Zika and Nipah and Ebola, and now this coronavirus, that has come. Ebola had a very high mortality. 50% of those who contracted Ebola died. Now, this doesn't have a high mortality, but it spreads very rapidly. It's very contagious. So here, only about 1.5% of those who have contracted the disease in the last 1 year have died. But because it spread very rapidly, so if large number of people get infected, a lot of people will die. Ebola wasn't spreading that rapidly, and it could be contained very quickly within 1 or 2 nations, and that's why only people there died. But if you have a virus which both spreads rapidly like this one and also has high mortality as Ebola, then within a few months, a few 100 million people would have died. So in this particular case, because it's very contagious, to prevent the large number of deaths from taking place, and what is called apex, to keep the numbers below the apex, a lockdown became necessary. Any country which delayed lockdown suffered. Like Britain, it delayed. USA, it delayed, and that's why large number of cases have come up in Britain. Large number of cases have come up in the US. In contrast, in China, they did a brutal lockdown because they're an authoritarian state, and that's why they could control it very quickly. And then they started working full steam within 3 months. So their economy could recover very fast, unlike most other economies, which have not recovered for 6 months, 9 months, and so on, because they've had to do repeated lockdown. Once the disease spreads and you're not able to contain it, then you have to do a lockdown. So Europe and USA has seen a second round of lockdown taking place. So the point is that lockdown only buys you time so that you can ramp up your medical facilities. You can see that the number of people who fall sick, their number remains below your medical capacity. So in India, you saw that a large number of people in Bangalore, in Bombay and Delhi, they were looking for beds and not able to find beds when the disease was at its peak. And that is what you have to try and prevent. But the point is that our lockdown was very sudden, and the imperatives that are needed to make it successful, those weren't put in place. So what are the imperatives? As I've highlighted in red, you need to decongest people in crowded areas. In slums of Bombay and Delhi, you could have 5 people, 10 people staying in one room. And in fact, in Bombay, some people sleep in shifts. So to have 24/7, 10 people stay in a 10 by 10 room is almost impossible. They will go out. So therefore, you needed to allow people to go back to their villages after testing, and then those remain behind. They could be dispersed in empty school grounds and empty school buildings, etc., so that people could be isolating themselves. Also, you needed to provide them with the essentials of life, like food and water. Most slums, don't have proper drinking water, much less water to keep washing their hands. So you needed to provide them with water and food, etc., so they didn't go out. They also have common toilets, and those again become sources of infection and spread of infections. So you needed to provide them with facilities. Then you needed to ramp up health infrastructure very quickly within a month or so that you could do contact tracing and testing. Unfortunately, we did not have that kind of contact tracing and the testing that was required. So we needed to do that. Unfortunately, that was not done. And also, small businesses start collapsing because they have only 1 week of working capital. So if they're closed down for a month or more, they completely finish their working capital, and then what happens is that they close down. Now these small businesses actually are the bulk of the employment in the economy. So of the MSME sector, 97.5% of the employment is in the micro sector. And if the micro sector starts shutting down, and that's what happened, then your unemployment becomes very, very high. And then it becomes very difficult to revive from that situation. But because we did not follow these imperatives and large number of people started moving, so the disease spread from urban areas to rural areas and to small towns where the health facilities are very poor. So this was the worry that we all had at that point of time in April, May, that if the disease spreads to these areas, then how would things be managed? That would become very difficult because we don't have data coming from the rural areas and small towns, of how many people get infected, how many people got died, etc. We don't have that data. Now, the situation, therefore, after lockdown became worse than what happens in a world war or what is the situation in the global financial crisis. The reason is that lockdown is a voluntary cessation of activity. Factories exist, offices exist, but people don't go to work. And that's why you saw that the pollution levels came down dramatically. You had pictures taken from Jalandhar of the Himalayas, or from Siliguri, you could see the Kanchenjunga peak because the air became very clean. This is what showed that the level of activity went down dramatically. So when voluntary cessation of activity takes place, then what does it do? It means production cannot take place, so supplies cannot go for further production. And also because people lose income, demand comes down. So in other words, both demand falls and supply gets disrupted. Now that doesn't happen during a war, because in a war, everybody is busy with the war effort, either fighting or producing aeroplanes or tanks and various other armaments, etc. So there's no demand shortage. Now, in a global financial crisis also, there was a demand crisis that took place. But here you had both demand crisis and supply shock. So this was a problem that was unique. It was unlike the World War or the global financial crisis. Now, in a war, as I said, there's no unemployment, but here in the US, in the first 12 weeks, 44 million people filed for unemployment. This was unprecedented because even in the 2007-9 global financial crisis, only 1/3 of this 44 million were unemployed. That means within 12 weeks, you had 3 times more unemployment now than you had during the global financial crisis. So this is the new situation which required a new, understanding of the macroeconomics. And that's why in my EPW article in September 26, 2020, I tried to say, how should this kind of situation be analyzed in the macro? Now, so what was the impact of the lockdown? It affected the poor and the marginalized very badly because most poor people earn daily and they buy their essentials daily. And as I said earlier, they cannot stock up. So as soon as their income stopped, they started starving, and that's why they started moving. You saw pictures of people willing to walk 1,000 kilometers. This girl taking her injured father 1,200 kilometers on the cycle, and many people died, just before they could even reach their village. They were dependent on the NGOs and people's charity on the way for food and water. The police also harassed them because the police was supposed to contain movement. So there was a lot of problem that took place. And the cottage sector, as I mentioned to you, exhausted their savings in a short while, and they have been having difficulty to restart. If you look at a ready patriwala, what does he do? He sells his produce during the day, and with the money that he gets, he buys the supply for next day, plus he uses that for his consumption. If he doesn't sell anything for a week, then he just eats up that. So his capital simply goes away. Similarly, the self-employed like traders, masons, taxi and auto drivers, barbers, they also earn every day and consume every day, and they also exhausted their savings. So the unorganized sector was hit very badly, and it has found it difficult to revive. Now, the other sector, the organized sector also, as I said, suffered because a lot of people got fired. According to CMI, in April, 17 million lost work, and of that, 5 million were professionals. And the balance of 122 million, they were the unorganized sector workers. Now, these people, because they have a higher salary, they have some savings, so they can continue their consumption of essentials. But here also, it was found that most of the people actually reduce their discretionary consumption. One friend of mine who's very rich and he has several cars, he said that he has postponed his purchase of car because he's very uncertain about what the future will be. So even the wealthy people who had the money, even they stopped buying things, except for the essentials. But what happened was that the upper middle class and the rich, they hoarded a lot of stuff. So the shelves are emptied out. In the US also, you had pictures of people just going and buying wholesale for 1 month, 2 months of supplies. You know, so the point is that the discretionary consumption stopped, but the essentials were hoarded. So what happens is that the companies which are part of the organized sector, they were required to pay wages. But that means without production and without revenue, if you have to pay wages, that means you're going to eat into your reserves, and that you cannot sustain for very long. And that's why companies paid some wages at least for the first month, and then they stopped paying wages. So in the organized sector, the wages of many people stopped. Then in the organized sector, you also have the self-employed, the elderly, and the retired, and they also lost income. The elderly and the retired, for instance, they depend on bank, fixed deposits for their income, and because the bank fixed deposit rates have come down, they were also eating into their saving. Then finally, there's something called the wealth effect. When the stock market came down in the beginning, up to the time of May, that time, everybody felt that their wealth was getting dissipated. And when you have a wealth effect, then you reduce expenditures. So you can see whether it's the upper classes or the middle classes or the lower classes, everybody lost incomes, and therefore the consumption demand came down dramatically all over the economy. Now, what also happened is that business failures were starting. Why? Because businesses which are stressed, which have very little reserves, they are the first ones to fail. Second, then there are the firms which are highly leveraged. That means their borrowings are very high compared to their equity. So their interest burden is very high. And when they stop sales, then what happens is that income is not coming in, so they're not able to pay the interest that they have to pay. In the financial sector, this is very important because in the financial sector, a lot of firms are highly leveraged, and also they're interconnected. So we saw during the Lehman moment in 2008 that one big firm fails, and the second phase and the third phase. So this interlinked failure is also a problem. Now, what happened was that the government announced a moratorium for payment of interest till August, first for 3 months, then for another 3 months, and that is still being settled. But once that settlement takes place, because your interest was accumulating during that period, so you have to continue to pay. Now that moratorium period, once it is over, then the RBI expects that the NPAs of the banks and the financial institutions will rise quite substantially. So therefore, the financial sector also comes under strain. And what happens is that for these stressed firms, revival becomes very difficult because the banks would not be willing to lend them more. And because of lack of working capital, they would not be able to revive. So therefore, in a sense, only businesses with large reserves are the ones that will do well, or those businesses which are producing essential items, which did not have to stop work, they will survive. Large number of other businesses that had low reserves or they were stressed or they had to stop functioning, they are the ones who will actually close down, and that will create a permanent problem for employment and income generation. Now, agriculture also suffered. So even though agriculture belongs to the primary sector, it can be performed in open area. So there's less chance of infection and spread of infection. Mining, forestry is also possible. Logging and fishing can also continue. But what happens is that as incomes drop, and we saw that during demonetization, so the 94% who lost, who are in the unorganized sector, who could not go to work, 200 million who lost work, when their income decline, then the demand for the basic items also declines, and that's why the prices for agriculture produce have been weak. Now, agriculture produce at the farms level, their prices dropped, but in the consumer centers in the urban areas where there were shortages because the supplies could not come to the cities, there you saw high prices. So you had shortages and profiteering taking place at the local level. So you had pictures during that period of people throwing the Shimla mirch and other such things onto the road because the Punjab farmers were complaining that at the farm gate they were getting only 1 rupee a kilo for Shimla mirch, whereas in Delhi it was selling for 50 rupees and 75 rupees a kilo. So you had this thing where at the farm level, the farmers' incomes dropped very sharply during that period because fruits, vegetables were rotting, similarly for milk and eggs and so on. So there was a big problem. Now, if the government had the capacity, it could have procured this and supplied it in the urban areas, then it would have taken care of the problem of the rural areas as well as the shortage of food in the urban areas with the poor people. Now, therefore, as a result, the recovery will be gradual. Now, lockdown has been relaxed since June in stages. We have had unlock 1 to unlock 6. But here we required much higher testing capacity and contact tracing, but we didn't have that, and that slowed down the recovery. Some of the factories, etc., that opened up, they had to close again because suddenly the disease spread in those factories. Low demand for discretionary items and investment still remaining small has meant that capacity utilization has been low, and when capacity utilization and consumer sentiment are low, then the production cannot revive at the same level. So production can only recover gradually, and it will not be a V-shape. A V-shaped recovery means that the production will rise as quickly as it dropped. That means in April, when it dropped by 75%, then by June, it should have risen by that amount also. Then we could have said that there's a V-shaped recovery. But an economy is not like a rubber ball. A rubber ball you throw to the ground, it bounces back. An economy is like a steering wheel. Slowly. So the revival also has been gradual. As I said, even in January now, you have a problem that, the economy is still 10% down compared to last year, January. So the revival has been very slow. Many businesses have exhausted their working capital or they are failing, and that's why they will not be able to revive quickly. And banks' own financial conditions will deteriorate, which will mean that the financial sector will also be under stress and will slow down the recovery. So what is the likely rate of growth? As I said, in April 2020, only the essentials were being produced. And when I counted that, looking at the GDP data, then only 25% can be counted as essential. So you can say 75% drop was there. And as I said, in this 25%, I'm including that agriculture could work, but even agriculture declined, in that period. So therefore, 25% size of operation is also quite, optimistic. So based on that and the fact that, we're still at 10% down and we've had a gradual recovery, the GDP fall for this year would be 30%, Now, that would mean a decline of 60 lakh crores in the GDP of the economy, and the economy will come down from 204 lakh crores in 2019-20 to about 145 lakh crores. So this graph shows you alternate, hypothesis, what would be the recovery. The blue graph is the one which the government felt would be a V-shaped recovery, where, you'd have a decline in April, the slight rise in May, and then from June onward with unlock, suddenly things would revive, and by August you'd be back to 4.5% rate of growth, which is what was there before the pandemic hit the economy. But if you look at the actual data, then we are growing along the yellow line. And then you can have different assumptions. One assumption is that by March this year, the economy would go back to where it was March last year. In that case, your decline would be 29%. If the decline is slower and it takes roughly a year to recover, from that point of time in 16 months, sorry, not a year, but 16 months after the first 2 months, that means over 1.5 years the recovery take place, then the rate of growth would be minus 33%. And if after the first 2 months the recovery takes in 22 months, that'd be minus 35.58%. In other words, the most optimistic scenario is that we would have a 29% decline. And even the government saying that within 2 months we'll start recovering back to where we were, and in 4 months, that is by August, we'll be back to where we were last year. Even then, it would be minus 12%, not minus 7.7%. Now, as a result of this massive decline, what has happened is that the government's resources have been very badly stretched. Tax collections have gone down, and my estimate is that the tax GDP ratio will fall from 16% of GDP last year to 14% in the current year. And because the GDP itself has dropped, so therefore the tax collections will drop from 36 lakh crores to about 20 lakh crore. And similarly, the non-tax revenue, which comes as dividend, etc., from the public sector, disinvestment, that has also dropped very sharply. As you know, disinvestment was slated to be 210 lakh crores, and it's only about 20,000 crores till now. But the government is projecting that by end of March, we'll have 36,000 crores. Even then, it'll be a very small percentage, hardly 15% of what the target was. So the government's revenues will come down dramatically this year, and the state governments will be affected very adversely because they have even fewer revenue sources. Government expenditure have a committed part like interest payment, etc. So government's expenditures cannot come down so sharply, and that's what you see in the budget this year, that the expenditures remain more or less at the level that was planned, but the revenues have come down, and that's why the deficit has risen dramatically. Now, the fiscal deficit last year was already about 10% of the expected GDP, but because the GDP itself has dropped, so that would be 15.5% of the reduced GDP. And then because revenues are down, that'd be another 11% of reduced GDP. So therefore, your fiscal deficit would rise by about, go up to about 26%, if you take center plus states, plus the public sector and so on and so forth. So there's a huge shortage of resources. But if you really need to protect the poor people, there are 200 million people who've lost work, and you need to give them half the World Bank extreme poverty line, which is $1.9 per person per day, and valued at 75 rupees to the dollar. Then you needed to give 12.4% of GDP to them. But we haven't done that. If you look at the data out of the budget, very little has been given extra, and that's why the difference between the revised estimates and the budget estimates is not very high at all. So I call this a survival package because you need to support the poor people, you need to support businesses, etc. And if you did the survival package along with the decline of the revenues that have taken place, then the deficit would have risen to 39%. But because we haven't spent that extra amount on expenditures for taking care of the poor, etc., so we find that it'll still be about 26%. In other words, the resource shortage in the budget is very high, and we needed to have redrawn the budget very quickly, but we didn't do that. Now, what also has happened is that the pandemic, various labor changes have been announced, and that is weakening the position of labor in the economy. Also, because large number of people went back to the rural areas, so we needed to increase the allocation to the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme but we've increased it only from 60,000 crores to 1.1 lakh crore. Whereas, the reports are that the large number of people who are wanting work are not getting it. Even in the month of December and January, the latest data that has come today is for January, but even in December, and people are getting only 45 days of work. So in other words, you needed to increase the allocation by a factor of 3 or 4 rather than just by 40,000 crores. Now, as a result, there's distress in rural areas because people are not getting employment. There's distress also in urban areas because urban employment has also suffered. And also, as far as the poor people are concerned, they have withdrawn their children from education, from schools, etc. So inequality will rise because, as the recent report showed, that 1 year of gap in education has meant that a lot of children have forgotten what they learned in the preceding class. So you will have inequality in education, in employment, and there will be a gender bias because a lot of women have lost work, and employment and wages will fall as a result of this unemployment. Now, the government's package, which was 20 lakh crore, but later increased further to 22 lakh crores, okay, uh, of this, only about 10% came from the budget, about 2 lakh crores. The rest was all loan and credit availability. Like the government's data shows that 9 lakh crore was the liquidity released by the RBI. Similarly, others, MSME, etc., there were loans being offered. But the question is, when the businesses are not working, they don't need loan. And that's why the credit offtake has been very low. And the RBI is telling the banks that they should lend more. But the banks are saying that when the demand for credit has gone down, how can we lend more? So banks flush with surplus have been depositing 6 to 8 lakh crores of their surplus money at reverse repo rate. So in other words, the policy package was actually a medium run and a long run package, whereas what was needed was immediate relief. So I have argued that it's like saying that if my house is burning, then somebody comes and says, okay, we'll buy more fire tenders, we'll set up a new fire station, whereas the house will burn by then. I need to throw water now. I don't need the fire tender to come later on. So the question is, okay, the fiscal deficit is already very high, and how do we fund the survival package so that we can pump in demand into the economy to those who are unemployed and those who've lost incomes and so on? One possibility is you can raise taxes, okay? But here, because a lot of business is down, so you can only raise taxes on the essentials, and that will be very difficult because you want to promote the essentials as cheap. So if you raise taxes on essentials, then the prices will go up, like is happening with diesel and petrol prices now, and that is eating into the budget of the general populace, and therefore their purchasing power goes down and demand will go down further, so that will be counterproductive. But you have tax expenditures, that is, tax concessions given to businesses, which are about 5% of GDP. You could curtail some of that, and especially in areas which are doing very well. There are two classes of companies, one which are producing essentials are doing very well, and the other which are the general, which are not doing so well. So tax expenditures could have been curtailed, and that is 5% of GDP, so some amount could have been obtained from there. Then people have been suggesting that you levy wealth tax, and very high rate. People have been suggesting even up to 4% of the wealth. But the problem is that, wealth tax you can levy on, say, 3% of the population. But at this point of time, if you levy wealth tax, then it will only lead to decline in asset prices. The reason very simple. Take, for instance, the Reliance share. I had a piece in the Wire pointing all this out. The Reliance share is about 2,000 rupees, but the share pays only 6.5 rupees of dividend. Now, if you levy a 2% tax on the Reliance share, because the Reliance prices have shot up, so it'll mean you have to pay 40 rupees of tax. Now, if you're getting an income of 6.5 rupees, but you have to pay 40 rupees of tax, then you have to sell some shares. So levying the wealth tax at this point where the incomes are down would imply that you have to sell a lot of assets. When a lot of assets come into the market at the same time, then obviously the asset prices will drop because the people who have surplus to buy, they'll be very few. So it's suggested that we disinvest in the public sector, we monetize the assets, and we levy wealth tax, try and raise resources, which will mean a huge amount of property, 8-10 lakh crores of property would come into the market with very few buyers, and therefore the property prices will drop, And what will that mean is that, there'll be trouble, there'll be a decline in investment because the investment sentiment will only decline if asset prices begin to drop very sharply. So the other alternative is you cut inessential government expenditures, and there are a lot of inessential government expenditures that could be done. And then finally, you can float COVID bonds. So those who have profited from that increase in their incomes, they could subscribe to it. The banks which are flush with funds, they could subscribe to it, and the balance then has to be monetized by the RBI. Now, this monetization of the deficit and the high deficit, it will not be inflationary because at this point we are suffering from demand shortage. We are not suffering from other problem, but we are suffering from demand shortage. So if this is a monetized deficit is there, it will only increase demand, and therefore it will actually spur the growth of the economy. Now, there are ethical aspects which are associated with this. So what we need is social justice. As I said, we are headed towards a new normal. So even capacity will be redefined due to the physical distancing needs that will be there. And also there'll be a lot more automation. People are buying a lot more from e-commerce rather than from brick and mortar stores. So there's a change also. Education is also more online than actually in physical form. So a lot of new things have come up, and these things are not going to go away very quickly. So we are headed towards a new normal, and we need to look at that. But if there's a lot more automation and a lot more, online classes, and the children of the poor are not able to afford the instruments, etc., then the marginalized will get even further marginalized. They have already been hit, three times earlier by demonetization in 2016, GST in 2017, NBFC crisis in 2018, and the forced digitization that's taking place, and now the pandemic. So the unorganized sector will be hit, and that's why the marginalization will increase further, inequality will increase further. And the unemployed people who are not able to get work back, they are acting as a reserve army of labor, which will keep the wages down, and that will further increase the inequality. And what was clear is that large number of people in India do not have a living wage. That means their wage is inadequate for any savings for them to be able to stock up or send the children for good education, etc. So what we need is that people should have a living wage so that they don't have to live in uncivilized conditions. In uncivilized conditions, it becomes very difficult to cope with the health crisis. So what the pandemic is pointing out is we are a collectivity. Unless we take care of the disease in the world as a whole, it'll keep spreading. And even a president of the US, the prime minister of the UK, the president of Brazil, home minister of India are not safe, and the disease has spread into the Antarctica also. So all parts of the world, and everybody gets affected. So we have to deal with the situation in a collective way. And that's why we have to see that the uncivilized conditions of living of the poor people, they're taken care of, because the pandemic will keep coming. As I said, this is the seventh virus, and another eighth virus is likely within the next 2 to 3 years. And if we are unlucky, it'll be very virulent and will have high mortality. So we have to prepare ourselves to see that these kind of things people are able to take care of. Now, the road ahead, therefore, will imply that we relook at the development paradigm, which is resulting in this high amount of inequality and this inability of the poor people to take care of themselves and their dependence on the state for this thing. So the problem is a collective one, and we need to strengthen the collectivity further. And this collectivity has to be both national and global, because unless we take care of the problem globally, the problem is not going to go away. So it's not as if the advanced countries take care of themselves through vaccination and let the disease fester in the developing world, because then it'll just spread back to them very quickly. We need to reduce alienation of the workers, because as Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, said repeatedly, when New York City was facing a huge crisis because the disease was spreading rapidly over there, he said that unless the population listens to the policymakers, the policies will be futile. He said, I want a lockdown, but if people don't follow the lockdown, then lockdown will not be successful. So how do you reduce alienation? To reduce alienation, you have to improve the working conditions of the poor people. And for that, you have to pay a living wage so that they feel that they're involved in the whole exercise of social living. Now, universal basic income has been proposed by the World Bank and others since 2014-15, but I don't like the idea of UBI, except as a very short-term measure when people have lost incomes. But in the long run, work is what gives dignity. So if you just give money free, it doesn't give you dignity. Now, with automation, many people will not be able to find work. So we may have to reduce the hours of work so that we can continue to have full employment. And technology has to be introduced in a socially responsible manner so it doesn't suddenly create a huge amount of unemployment in the economy. So the crisis is a challenge, and the challenge is how to bring about genuine reform. So in conclusion, uh, machines and factories and offices existed, but the economy had stalled because people could not go out. The poor and the unorganized sectors, producers who have little savings, they needed support. And for that, you needed to expand the PDS system. Unfortunately, that was not done. The question is that the marginalized were always marginalized, and the pandemic has marginalized them further because inequalities are increasing and employment generation has declined. We need to step up the health infrastructure dramatically. Our health infrastructure in rural areas and smaller cities is very poor, but even in the big cities, it needs to be ramped up. Otherwise, with the next pandemic, we could have another very big breakdown. So we have to protect our society from a major breakdown that could take place. Government's resource position is greatly stretched as the fiscal deficit data shows, and therefore the budget needed to be reformulated. Unfortunately, that was not done. And the budget now also has been presented in the framework of the supply side rather than demand side. So the budget would not be able to revive the economy as it was hoped that the budget would pump in purchasing power into the hands of the people who have lost incomes so that demand revives. Now, if demand doesn't revive, then investment would not revive. If capacity utilization remains below 60%, then why would people invest? Think of a company that produces 100 meters of cloth, but they're only able to sell 60. Then why would it increase capacity to 110 meters of cloth? So it's very important that demand revives so that capacity utilization goes up to 85, 90% and investment revives. This year, the investment will be very low because capacity utilization is still very low. And therefore, the rate of growth is not going to pick up as much as it should have picked up. So in 2021 also, we are unlikely to go back to the level of production of 2019. That means we've lost 2 years of production in the economy. So the problem is the uneven development of the economy that we have seen, and we need a rethink about that development paradigm. Without the rethink, we are not going to be able to, manage the crisis. And in that development paradigm, we have to worry about inequality, about trade, about the nature of openness of the economy, the environment, the travel, the education, and so on. Now, the government has felt that, by offering concessions to foreign capital, it can try and attract foreign capital from China to India. Now, that is very unlikely because most countries are wanting to shorten their supply chain. That's the new normal. And they are asking their own capital to come back to their own country. Mr. Trump said that, he said that, he's asked American capital to return to the US. Now, that kind of situation is also true for Europe, etc., because people have seen that, with long supply chains, when there's a disturbance, then their economy suffers. So it's unlikely that a lot of capital will come into India. Actually, most capital will go back to to their own country. That's what our Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign also is, that we want our capital to create, capacity within India. So that would be also the case with most other economies. So expecting foreign capital to come in any big way is, the wrong kind of expectation. We have to see how to promote our own internal investment, and cope with the kind of issues that have come up in the Indian economy. Now, this requires a lot of rethink and a lot of generation of new ideas. But unfortunately, our opposition is completely decimated, and therefore the ideas from the opposition is not coming. Ideas are coming from farmers, who are protesting, or the workers of the public sector units who are protesting against privatization. But this needs to be carried forward in a political way for change to take place. So what we need are socio-political movements which will try and look at the development paradigm, suggest alternatives so that we can become a more secure and a more steady society which can cope with the challenges that are lurking ahead. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, sir. Uh, I would request everyone who have questions to put them in the Q&A box. In the meantime, sir, we have a few questions already, and I'll
Yeah.
read them out for you, and you can then answer them.
Okay.
Uh, so, one person has asked, Sakshi Sharma has asked, Sir, as you said in the very beginning, that it might take around 15 to 17 years to cure the entire population of India. Don't you think that during this span of time, there will be more people who would be adversely affected by COVID? What, according to you, shall the government do regarding this? Shall we accept this pandemic? Shall we accept that this pandemic will last for years and isolate ourselves again for least infection?
No.
So
So
that, yeah,
so
that's the question.
the reason I mentioned that was because we were supposed to start vaccinating in a very major way. We are the largest producer of the vaccine. Serum Institute can produce billions of doses very quickly. Now, what Serum Institute is complaining is that we have the vaccine, but the vaccination is not taking place so rapidly. You know, so in the first month, we haven't even completed 1 crore, vaccinations, whereas we were supposed to complete at least 1 crore of vaccinations. Now, if suppose we are 138 crore people, and if we have to vaccinate, twice, because these doses have to be given 2 times, so we need 276 crore vaccination. So therefore, if you divide by 12 months, if suppose you want to achieve this within 12 months, if the longevity of the vaccine is 12 months, then you require at least, some like 20 crore people to be vaccinated every month. If you don't do that, then you will not be able to vaccinate your entire population in 1 year. And if you have to wait 17 years, then and you have to vaccinate people every year, then you'll never complete it. Okay. So my point the point I'm making is that we need to ramp up vaccination dramatically. From less than 1 crore a month to we have to go to some like 20 crore a month. And for that we need massive infrastructure. This massive infrastructure in the public sector and the private sector, that has to be geared up. And also, I've been arguing in my book and elsewhere earlier that you have to do the testing free, because large number of poor people are unable to afford testing, so they don't get testing done. And also, you have to do the vaccination free, because the private sector is saying that we'll charge 1,000 rupees for vaccine, and so for 2 shots it'll be 90% of Delhiites spend less than 25,000 rupees per month. Now, if you're only spending 25,000 rupees per month or less, then you can't afford to spend 10,000 rupees on vaccinating your family. So that's why my argument is it should be free. Then vaccinate everybody rapidly, because like a public good, because if even one person has it, it'll spread again. So treat it like a public good, make it free, and do it very rapidly. That's the point I'm making.
Thank you, sir. There's another question
Yeah.
related to the same thing.
Uh,
Anmol has asked, how will vaccines impact the state of the economy?
Okay. Now, you see, if you don't vaccinate and the disease keeps spreading, then you'll have to keep on having lockdown, like it's happened in Britain, like it's happened in Europe, like it's happened in America, and so on. So instead of a shallow recovery, the economy will again dip. So people then say that it's like a W shape, and when the economy again dips, then you lose production again, you lose incomes again, and people go into a crisis. Investment comes down, the uncertainty increases, and when there's uncertainty, then what happens is people go liquid, they don't invest, and therefore the economy will be in deeper trouble. So that's why vaccination is very important, so that the spread of the disease can be controlled. And rapid is very important because the disease will keep mutating. See, the South African or the British or the Brazilian are mutants. You know, in nature there are some like 5 million viruses. Of them, only 5,000 affect human beings, but they keep mutating, and when they mutate, they can jump to human beings. So that's what seems to have happened with this coronavirus. That has jumped from bat or from pangolin or something in Wuhan wet market, and once it jumps to humans, then human to human transmission takes place. So therefore, it's very essential to control the disease. If you don't control the disease, then your economy will continue to suffer. That's what the difference between China and the US is. China brutally controlled the disease within the first 2 months, and then now its economy is revived, it's bouncing back. You know, so it was the only economy which in the second quarter had a positive rate of growth. Every other economy has had negative rates of growth since that time. So USA, which delayed it, has suffered. And you see people, standing in food queues and food lines, etc. Very surprisingly, you see people coming in Mercedes Benz and BMWs to collect food from the food lines. So you see these long lines, 5 miles long lines in America of cars. They're driving by collecting food, from the free food centers. So the kind of crisis, as I said, 44 million people lost employment within the first 12 weeks. That's 1/3 of their workforce. And there in America, because people have very little savings, so therefore they go into a shock. A lot of people have lost even their houses, because they couldn't pay the rent. So they were out on the streets. So the kind of crisis that has come, we have to prevent that from happening in India. And that's why vaccination is very, very important.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. Another question a
Mhm.
student has asked is, since capital expenditure is said to be an investment in the future, don't you think government should have increased its revenue expenditure and directly provided liquidity to the bottom 40% population?
So you are absolutely right. At this point of time, you needed to provide direct support, by expanding the rural employment guarantee scheme. So my argument was that, the rural employment guarantee scheme should have been stepped up from, about 60,000 crores to about 3 lakh crores, so that large number of people who went back, a lot of people who lost work in the rural areas, they would have got it. But you have only expanded it from 60,000 crores to 1.1 lakh crores by 50,000 crores. And as the data shows, people have been only getting 40, 45 days of work rather than 100 days of work. And because work is not available, maybe you needed to expand it to 200 days of work. There was some proposal for that also. So therefore, 4 times there plus extra. So you needed to expand the rural employment guarantee scheme by at least maybe 4 or 5 times. And similarly, urban areas, you needed to start a scheme similar to the rural employment guarantee scheme. In fact, I've been arguing for that from even before the pandemic, because a lot of people in the urban areas have been losing work because the economy has been slowing down from 8% to 3.5% even before the pandemic. So a lot of people had lost work. So I was arguing for an urban guarantee scheme. And there, what you needed to do was spend on the local infrastructure like education and health. You need to expand education and health because it's very woeful. You needed to do contact tracing. You needed to do, testing. So a lot of people could be set to work in that, plus local infrastructure like in rural areas, rural roads, telecom, and various other small projects. Now, if you spend on big projects, what the government is doing is it's increasing capital expenditure on big projects like the railway freight corridor or the big roads. Now, those are highly automated construction. I remember as a child, seeing these road construction projects, hundreds of people would be working there, with only one big machine there. Everything else was manual. Now you see 5 people working with big bulldozers and big cranes, etc. So you don't see hundreds of people working. So even the heavy infrastructure that the government is thinking of, even that doesn't produce much of employment directly. Indirect employment would be the same whether you do the small infrastructure or the big infrastructure, but directly does not produce much employment. So the government needed a strategy which was a demand side strategy. Unfortunately, it has gone in for a supply side strategy, and that is where the problem is. So I agree that, capital expenditure on small projects needed to be expanded and giving more aid to the people. So the fiscal deficit would have risen. But at this point of time, it doesn't matter if the fiscal deficit rises, but the government has been very conservative. It doesn't want the fiscal deficit to rise. And that's why you see the total expenditure in the budget has been raised from 34.5 lakh crores to 34.8 lakh crore. That means not even 1% increase in the government expenditure, the central government's expenditure. So therefore, the demand will remain short. And the problem of the economy, the demand problem, that will continue.
Right, sir. Yes. So the next question is,
Yeah.
was there any other solution to stop the spread of COVID other than the lockdown?
Well, there was none because we didn't have the vaccine. We didn't have the medicine. There's in my book, I have discussed the difference between a vaccine and a medicine. vaccine produces antibodies and the medicine kills the foreign particle, so you needed either a vaccine or a medicine or both. We didn't have, because the body doesn't recognize a new particle. So it takes time. And in the beginning, we didn't even know how to treat it. How it's only after 4 or 5 months that we realized how to treat it. That's why in the first flush, about like in Britain and Spain and Italy, 10 to 15% of the people who got the disease were dying. Now that percentage has come down to 1.5% or even less, because now we know how to treat it. So there was no way. The only thing we could do was to slow down the spread of the disease. If we didn't do the slow down of the spread of the disease by doing lockdown, like happened in America, then the disease continues to spread. And you have very high levels of disease. And when you have high levels of disease, then it's the capacity of the health system. And America has the best capacity in health systems. Even America was getting overwhelmed. Many states of America, including New York City, it was almost getting overwhelmed. But because of Andrew Cuomo's steps that he took, they didn't reach what is called the apex. So disease didn't cross that peak, which was about. But in many cities, hospitals didn't have capacity. Like in India, you found stories of people in Delhi or Bombay dying outside the hospitals because there was no bed available, or dying in the ambulance because the ambulance was going from one hospital to the other hospital and not able to find a bed, And we don't know what's happened in rural areas or in the small towns, whether people did die or didn't die because, there was not. But one study that has come out shows that Indians may have a higher immunity because we live in uncivilized conditions. Our immunity levels are higher because we are all the time under attack from diseases, Now, that is one possibility why in India we peaked in September, and then after that the peak came down and the deaths have not been as high as was feared. But then, we are also a younger population than Europe and America and Japan. But, the problem is that, we don't know enough about this disease, This virus keeps changing, like in Britain, they thought they had controlled it. And now the second wave has been deadly, and that the British virus has spread to 50 countries, The South African variety against which the Serum Institute vaccine is not very effective, that is also spreading now, And therefore, we need to keep tweaking the vaccine, like happens in influenza. The influenza virus keeps changing every year. So we have to keep changing the vaccine also every year, and that's why we need a vaccination shot every year for influenza. Now, if that happens with this virus also, it is far more infectious, and the South African and the British versions are very infectious. So if that happens, then we'll have to do very fast research. That's why we have to spend a lot more on higher education and on R&D, because we'll keep on facing these challenges. So in the new normal, education would require enormous support. R&D would require a lot of support also.
Right, sir. And the next question says, does India have the ability to reach the massive targets or ideal conditions we need to achieve to get back to normalcy in terms of business and economy?
Well, you see, what do you do in a war? In a war, all resources are pooled together, because you have to fight, otherwise you'll lose. So this is like a war. If we don't treat it like a war and don't, gear up like a war, then we'll always be fighting a losing battle. So I think there's no option. We have to gear up. We have to increase our research and development. We have to do massive testing and tracing. We have to do massive vaccination. And we should forget everything else. Unfortunately, our attention is getting diverted. Sometimes there's a farmers crisis, sometimes there's a labor crisis, sometimes there's some other crisis. We all need to put our heads together and forget all these divisive issues and just try and deal with the crisis. So at this point, government and the others, they should not raise divisive issues. Anything which divides us will divide our attention. We'll not be able to cope with it. Like in a war, if you have a divided attention, you lose. If there's internal strife while there's a war going on, then your country is going to lose. So today also, we should just forget any divisive issue. Just go and deal with this crisis so that the economy can revive, the people's incomes can revive, and then later on deal with the issues.
That's right, sir. Should I take, we have three more questions. Should I
Okay.
read them?
Okay.
The next question says, if the Indian government has an option to either speed up the vaccination process by taking up foreign debt and outsourcing the vaccines, or letting the rate at which vaccine is being distributed slow, but making the process self-reliant, what should they do? Which would affect economy more?
So, we don't need any foreign aid. Our Serum Institute is the biggest producer of vaccines in the world. It can produce, a billion doses very easily, and it can ramp it up and produce 2 billion doses. And that would be enough to, create herd immunity in India. So we'll need, as Serum Institute said, earlier on, that we need about 70,000 crores of resources to vaccinate everybody. And that is something in a 200 lakh crore economy, which should not be difficult to get, because that should be our first priority. So if we cut down on our wasteful expenditures everywhere, 70,000 crores is not a big number, you know. So I think we can do it on our own. It's an organizational problem. We're not organizing ourselves well enough to actually deal with the crisis. How to reach the vaccine to everybody, that is the big problem. So even if we take foreign aid, the question will still remain: how do we organize the giving of vaccine to everybody? And we conduct elections in a large way, we conduct vaccination in a large way, children's vaccination, etc. We should pool all that together, you know and start doing it in a big way. Start doing 20 crore vaccination every month, so that within a space of about 6 to 8 months we could get to herd immunity. And that's not rocket science. It's a simple organizational issue. We have to just put our heads down and organize in such a way that we can do it. We don't need any foreign aid. We have the vaccine ourselves. We don't need any foreign money to buy that vaccine, because that much resource we can raise from within the economy itself. And the budget has already allotted 35,000 crores of rupees. It can allot another 35,000 crores and inoculate everybody.
Right, sir. The next student asks,
Yes.
did COVID do countries good by urging them to be self-reliant and restricting exchange between them?
Well, one can always try and read something positive and negative, but large number of people have died. So I would never look at a pandemic as anything positive. But yes, if you can develop your resolve and your will to act as a nation, act as a collectivity, if you can then resolve how to tackle the problems that face society, and redo your development paradigm. It's like environment is very crucial. Why is it that 6 and 7 viruses have come within the last 20 years? And that is because nature is getting disturbed, the environment is getting disturbed, and animals are coming closer to the human beings. And like for instance, when you have chicken, the way you keep chicken, keep them very close to each other, the virus keeps jumping from one to the other, and in the process of jumping, it mutates. Okay. Similarly, you keep the way we bring up pigs, the way we bring up chicks and so on in the poultry sector, the virus will mutate. So we need to restore the balance with environment, so that the viruses don't spread that fast. They don't mutate that fast. If they don't mutate that fast, then the new viruses will take time to come. Otherwise, the viruses will come very rapidly, And because the environment is going to damage your agriculture and others, the capacity of human beings to take care of themselves will also decline. So in a sense, taking care of environment has become very crucial. So that kind of rethinking has to be done. So I think in that sense, we can say that it's a danger, it's a warning signal that if humanity has to survive, we need to rethink our development paradigm. But I wouldn't say a pandemic is a positive thing. We should have been smart enough to realize that, without a pandemic coming, why are we so weak that only when a crisis comes do we rethink? I mean, otherwise it's been obvious. Large number of people have been, talking about environmental protection, about climate change for a long time. And yet, as a human race, we're not doing that.
Right, sir. That's true. And there's one more question which
Yes.
says, can we restore the normal through calibrated transmission of infections and attain herd immunity and limit reliance on vaccinations?
So, herd immunity means 60%, and by the time you get to herd immunity, the disease would have spread to a lot of people. And even if, say, 1.5% people die, but suppose it spreads to 60% of India, which is 800 million, Now, if 800 million people contract the disease, at least 10% would require hospitalization. That means 80 million. And 1.5% would die. That means about 12 million. That's a huge cost, you know. So therefore, this control has to be through lockdown so that the disease spreads slowly and doesn't overwhelm, so that that 1.5% remains small. And once the vaccination begins to take place, then fewer people will contract the disease and the fewer people will die. So I think, just letting it happen like in Brazil, you saw these pictures in Brazil of thousands of graves being dug because people are dying in large numbers over there, Uh, so a very frightening picture, graves in thousands because people are dying in such a large number because Bolsonaro said let the disease spread. Britain learned its lesson within a week. Britain also thought, let's do herd immunity, let's let it spread, in a controlled way. And within 1 week, they realized that it was going out of hand and their health system would collapse. And in fact, literally the health system there collapsed. Sweden also tried for herd immunity, but then the largest in Europe, the largest number of deaths per thousand population took place in Sweden. That means Sweden had to pay quite a high cost. So Sweden, which is a very advanced country and with very good health infrastructure, even that suffered. Now imagine something like that in India with our very poor health infrastructure. If we had gone in for herd immunity, allowed things to just keep spreading, until September, middle of September, when we peaked at about almost a lakh per day of cases, the fear was that we'll very soon have the largest number of cases in the world. You know, it's only because of lockdown and only because, by then we had ramped up testing, contact tracing, and so on, that we managed to bring it down after that, And even now we are in danger of a second round, We are lucky that we haven't had a second round in winter. We didn't have a second round in spite of Bihar election. We didn't have a second round in spite of the farmers' agitation, where you see farmers, they're not using any, masks, etc., So we are very lucky. Let us hope we remain lucky, that we hope that, the South African and the British variant doesn't enter India in a big way. But for that, you have to prevent it from happening. So I think we have to be very careful. We can't be casual. We can't say, okay, let it spread. There'll be herd immunity after a while, because by then a lot of people would die, and, as Andrew Cuomo said, we have to preserve life, because once life is there, the work can be done. If life is gone, then work cannot be done. So protecting life has to come first. A lot of businessmen feel that, work has to be protected first and then life. But I think, Andrew Cuomo's argument is correct that, we have to protect life and then we'll revive the economy and livelihood would come.
Right. So you have so rightly put it. And we have the last question.
Yeah.
How was China able to get back to the full steam after lockdown?
Well, as I said, you see, the lockdown was brutal. So they controlled the number of cases. In India, we had to start relaxing the lockdown when the cases were still rising. And therefore, the disease was continuing to spread. So if you first control the disease, and then you don't let it come from outside. So China has got strict controls on people traveling, from outside. Okay. So they are an authoritarian society. They could do a brutal lockdown. The way the Hubei province was shut down, the Wuhan city was shut down, and for months nobody was allowed to go in or go out. That's how they prevented the spread of the disease to the other parts of China. And then even after that, whenever some disease was like in Beijing, they had discovered in one area, immediately there was a complete lockdown of that area. Nobody could go in or go out of it. Similarly, if they found that people coming from outside had some disease, they'd immediately, have very strict controls at the airport. So they, because of the authoritarian state that they could implement the lockdown brutally, and that's how they could control the disease, and that's how their economy has revived. Because once you're able to control the disease, look, they were the ones where it all started, but they have had one of the smallest number of infections and one of the smallest number of deaths, whereas that is where it all started from. So it shows what is needed. We have to be very strict about our lockdown. we can't be very casual. I mean, now currently you see people traveling in the metros in Bombay without masks. So it's from yesterday onward they've started fining people, etc. But that's a very casual attitude, because it's a mask is a social thing. you know because you see, it's a social responsibility to the other. I could spread it to somebody else could spread it to me, and I would spread it to my family. Like children, it has been found they don't get a high this thing degree of contagion, but they spread it to the family members. So children will not show many symptoms. Young people may not show symptoms, maybe asymptomatic, but they'll give the disease to their parents and to their grandparents, and then they will suffer. So I think we have to be very careful about dealing with it, and it's a social responsibility, and that's why I keep saying it's a collectivity. It has brought home to us that the disease shows that society is a collective, and we have to deal with things collectively, and that's why we have to care about everybody.
Right, sir. That brings us to the close of the session. Thank you so much, sir. It was a very, very insightful session, and you gave us all the relevant data, and you increased our understanding about the whole topic, the economy, the disease, and also I think you are leaving us more curious to know more, go out, and also a little more responsible to tackle this, as like you said repeatedly, collectively. So
in my book, I have discussed all these things in much greater detail.
yes.
So if anybody wants to know more, they can look at the book, where all these health aspect, economic aspect, the social aspect, they have all been dealt in much greater detail.
Right. So I'll request all my audience. So whenever, sir, your book, whenever it is out.
It came out in December.
Okay, it came out in December. If you could announce the name, and we'll know that, so we can also spread it amongst our student body. And
so it's called The Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis: Impact of Coronavirus in the Road Ahead. And on Amazon, it has been the #1 bestseller for the last 2 weeks.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So yeah. Amazon, a lot of demand has been there.
Right.
But from 24th December, it was available at Bahari and Sons, and then also at Amazon from 31st of December.
Okay.
So and my interview with Karan Thapar went viral.
Right.
He did it on 30th of January, and that spread the word a lot. So Barkha Dutt's interview was also there on 31st December.
Okay.
That also went a lot. So a lot of people got to know about the book through that.
Right.
So anyway, so it's now selling quite well on the Amazon.
Right, sir. So we'll just send the link to all our student body, and I think they'll really would want to get it and read this.
Some people may be interested in learning more, but others it may be. So for anybody who's interested could get a lot more out of the book. Because I've given, 2/3 of the book is text and 1/3 is data. So there's data and annexures, explaining the disease and what happened in the economy. So as far as I could collect the data, I've tried to pack it in. So 200 pages out of 300 pages is the text, and 100 pages are annexures, data, graphs, tables, bibliography, etc.
Right. So I think that's even better for our students who like a lot of data.
Yeah.
Right. And analysis. Right, sir. So I again thank you, and I would like to invite our Dean, Dr. G.L. Tayal, for a brief vote of thanks. Sir, can you please come in?
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. I'm grateful to Professor Khan also for giving us this opportunity, because twice, last year you had come to the campus and it was really an exciting session. This year also. I'm sorry, I was busy in a lecture, so for some time I was not present in your lecture. But then it has been, I believe, the way the question answer session has gone, your speech has generated a lot of heat, and it is certainly so, because it's a very topical thing what you're talking about, that it's a social responsibility, and probably what you have said, that protection of life is the first thing. And with that sensitivity, you are giving a lot of figures, a lot of facts, a lot of data. That is something which is essentially is very, very exciting. So we would only hope that you will keep coming to us and benefit our students by your analysis, by your logic, by your depth of the knowledge and the richness of the knowledge about the subject, sir. Thank you so much once again, sir. And we hope that you will keep coming to our institute.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you,
I
sir.
enjoyed the session. Thanks a lot.
Also, sir, as a token of appreciation and thanking you, we have planted a tree in your name. This is done under Project Panch Dhanam in Telangana. We could not meet you in person, so we found an eco-friendly way of
Great.
showing our gratitude. And really
Thanks
want to
a lot.
thank you for taking time out and coming and sharing your so much knowledge and insights with our students. So
Thank you very much. Thanks for doing that. All the
thank you,
best.
sir. Thank you so much, sir. It's
All
a
the best to
privilege.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Khan.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, sir.
Thank you,
Thanks
sir.
a lot.
See you in better times.
Yes, sir. Hope to see you soon.
See you in better times. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All the best.
Okay. Thank you, sir.